The images coming out of Donetsk right now tell a story that Western media won't touch, and it's a story that changes everything we've been told about this conflict. What we're witnessing isn't just a tactical retreat or a strategic repositioning. This is a collapse of morale, a breakdown of cohesion, and it's happening in real time as Russian forces push through positions that were supposed to hold for months. Ukrainian troops are abandoning their posts, leaving behind equipment, ammunition, everything. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, why now? After nearly 3 years of this grinding war, after billions in Western aid, after all the assurances from Washington and Brussels that Ukraine was winning, why are we seeing scenes like this? The answer lies in what's been hidden from us all along. The narrative we've been fed about an inevitable Ukrainian victory, about Russia running out of missiles, about Putin's regime collapsing, none of it aligned with the reality on the ground. What's unfolding in Donetsk is the culmination of decisions made in distant capitals by people who never had to face the consequences of their geopolitical chess games. And the soldiers running from those trenches, they're the ones paying the price for a strategy that was doomed from the start. Let me take you back to where this all began, because context matters, and without it, we're just consuming headlines without understanding the forces that created them. When this conflict erupted in early 2022, the Western establishment and its media apparatus immediately framed it as an unprovoked act of aggression by a madman in Moscow. That narrative was simple, digestible, and it fit perfectly into the good versus evil framework that plays so well on television. But anyone who had been paying attention to the region for the previous decade knew that this story was far more complex, far more nuanced, and far more tragic than what we were being told. The roots of this crisis go back to 2014, to the Maidan coup that overthrew a democratically elected government in Kiev, to the expansion of NATO eastward, despite explicit promises made to Russian leaders in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse, and to the deliberate provocations that transformed Ukraine into a geopolitical battleground rather than a bridge between East and West. What we're seeing now in Donetsk is the inevitable conclusion of a strategy that was built on wishful thinking, ideological rigidity, and a fundamental misunderstanding of Russian capabilities, resolve, and strategic patience. The architects of this policy in Washington, London, and Brussels genuinely believed that they could bleed Russia dry through a proxy war, that economic sanctions would bring the Russian economy to its knees, and that Putin's government would collapse under the weight of domestic discontent. They were wrong on every count, not slightly wrong, not partially wrong, but catastrophically wrong. And the evidence of that miscalculation is now playing out in real time across the battlefields of eastern Ukraine, where exhausted soldiers are making the rational decision to preserve their lives rather than die for a cause that their own leadership has mismanaged into oblivion. Think about what these troops have endured over the past nearly 3 years. They've been subjected to relentless artillery bombardments, drone strikes, and combined arms operations by an adversary that has adapted, learned, and evolved its tactics with impressive speed. They've watched their comrades die in trenches that were supposed to be impregnable, in towns that were supposed to be held at all costs, for objectives that were supposed to turn the tide of the war. They've been told repeatedly that Western weapon systems would give them a decisive advantage, that F-16 fighter jets would establish air superiority, that Patriot missile systems would create an impenetrable shield, that HIMARS rocket systems would devastate Russian logistics. And yet here they are, 3 years later, watching Russian forces advance methodically through the very heartland of the Donbas region that this entire war was supposedly about protecting. The reality is that modern warfare is not about wonder weapons or technological silver bullets. It's about industrial capacity, logistical sustainment, manpower reserves, and above all, it's about having a coherent strategy that aligns military operations with achievable political objectives. Russia has demonstrated all of these capabilities while Ukraine and its Western backers have failed on virtually every metric. The Russian military-industrial complex has ramped up production of artillery shells, missiles, and armored vehicles to levels that dwarf anything the collective West is currently producing. Their logistics networks have proven resilient despite constant Ukrainian attempts to disrupt them. Their manpower reserves, contrary to Western media reports about Russia running out of soldiers, have remained adequate to sustain offensive operations across multiple fronts. And perhaps most importantly, they have maintained a clear, consistent strategic objective throughout this conflict, which is to secure the Russian-speaking regions of eastern Ukraine and ensure that Ukraine never becomes a NATO member state that poses a direct military threat to Russian security. Now contrast that with the Ukrainian position, which has been characterized by constantly shifting objectives, unrealistic goals, and a fundamental dependence on Western support that was never going to be sustainable indefinitely. In the early months of the war, Ukrainian leadership spoke of retaking Crimea, of driving Russian forces entirely out of Ukrainian territory, including the Donbas region, of achieving a complete military victory that would humiliate Putin and potentially lead to regime change in Moscow. These were fantasy objectives divorced from military reality, but they served a political purpose by rallying Western support and justifying the enormous transfer of weapons and financial aid to Kyiv. As the war dragged on and these objectives proved unattainable, the goalposts kept shifting. Victory became defined as holding the line, then as preventing further Russian advances, then as simply surviving until the next round of Western aid packages could arrive. What we're witnessing in Donetsk right now is the psychological and physical breaking point of an army that has been pushed beyond its limits in service of a strategy that was never viable. When soldiers abandon their positions en masse, it's not because they lack courage or patriotism, it's because they've reached the rational conclusion that dying in a hopeless defensive position serves no purpose, that their leadership has failed them, and that preservation of life becomes the only logical choice. This is not unique to the Ukrainian military. Every army in history that has been placed in an untenable strategic position has eventually experienced this kind of breakdown in unit cohesion. We saw it with the French army in 1940, with the Iraqi army in 2003, with the Afghan National Army in 2021. When soldiers lose faith that their sacrifices will achieve any meaningful objective, when they see their officers enriching themselves while ordinary troops suffer, when they realize that the gap between the official narrative and the reality on the ground has become unbridgeable, they make the entirely human decision to walk away. And here's what makes this particularly tragic. The Ukrainian people, the ordinary citizens who have endured this nightmare, they deserved better. They deserved leadership that would have pursued a diplomatic solution before this catastrophe began. They deserved Western partners who would have been honest about Ukraine's strategic limitations rather than filling their heads with false hopes and impossible promises. They deserved a media that would have told them the truth about the military balance rather than feeding them a steady diet of propaganda about Russian failures and Ukrainian victories that existed primarily in press releases and Twitter threads. Instead, they got leaders who chose confrontation over negotiation, Western partners who were willing to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian, and a media ecosystem that prioritized narrative management over factual reporting. The Western media's role in this catastrophe cannot be overstated. For nearly 3 years, major news outlets have functioned essentially as propaganda organs, uncritically repeating Ukrainian government claims, hyping every minor tactical success, while downplaying or ignoring major strategic setbacks, and creating an alternate reality where Ukraine was perpetually on the verge of a decisive breakthrough. Remember the 2023 counteroffensive that was going to split Russian forces in half and drive to the Sea of Azov? We were told that this was Ukraine's moment, that Western trained brigades equipped with NATO weapons would demonstrate the superiority of Western military doctrine. What actually happened was a grinding, costly failure that resulted in catastrophic Ukrainian casualties and minimal territorial gains. But you wouldn't know that from reading most Western media coverage, which spun the debacle as a learning experience and immediately pivoted to the next supposed game changer. This pattern of overpromising and underdelivering has not only misled the public, it has contributed to policy decisions that prolonged the conflict unnecessarily and cost countless lives. When Western leaders believed their own propaganda about Russian weakness and Ukrainian strength, they made decisions that foreclosed diplomatic options and locked both sides into a trajectory of continued fighting. When they convinced themselves that just one more weapon system, just one more aid package, just one more round of sanctions would tip the balance, they extended a war that was ultimately unwinnable for their Ukrainian proxies. And now, as we watch Ukrainian troops flee their positions in Donetsk, we're seeing the final collapse of a strategy that was built on illusions rather than reality. Let's talk about what this means for the broader geopolitical landscape, because the implications extend far beyond the battlefields of eastern Ukraine. The failure of the Western proxy war strategy against Russia represents a fundamental shift in the global balance of power. For decades, the United States and its allies operated under the assumption that they could shape events anywhere in the world through a combination of economic coercion, military intervention, and information dominance. The Ukraine conflict has exposed the limits of that power in ways that will reverberate for decades to come. Russia has demonstrated that a determined regional power with significant natural resources, nuclear weapons, and a willingness to endure economic pressure can resist Western attempts at coercion. China has been watching closely and drawing its own conclusions about Taiwan and American security guarantees. Countries across the global south have seen how easily Western leaders will sacrifice a partner's interests for their own geopolitical objectives, and they're adjusting their alignment strategies accordingly. The economic dimensions of this shift are equally significant. The sanctions regime imposed on Russia was supposed to be devastating, a demonstration of Western economic might that would bring Moscow to its knees. Instead, the Russian economy has proven remarkably resilient, finding new markets in Asia and the global south, developing alternative payment systems to circumvent Western financial infrastructure, and actually growing in certain sectors due to import substitution and domestic industrial development. Meanwhile, the costs of the sanctions have been borne disproportionately by European consumers and businesses, contributing to deindustrialization in Germany, energy crises across the continent, and a growing recognition that decoupling from Russian resources was a self-inflicted wound that damaged Europe far more than it damaged Russia. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency has been undermined by the weaponization of Western financial systems, accelerating a trend toward de-dollarization that will fundamentally reshape international trade and finance in the coming decades. And what of the moral dimensions of this conflict? We've been told repeatedly that this is a battle for democracy, for freedom, for the rule-based international order, but let's examine that claim honestly. The Ukrainian government that the West has been supporting suspended opposition parties, shuttered independent media outlets, cancelled elections, and engaged in systematic repression of dissent. The rule-based international order that we're supposedly defending is one where the United States can invade Iraq based on fabricated intelligence, where NATO can bomb Libya into chaos, where Western powers can support regime change operations whenever it suits their interests, but where Russia is uniquely evil for pursuing its security interests in its near abroad. This isn't to justify Russian actions, but rather to point out the staggering hypocrisy of the moral framework that has been imposed on this conflict. If we're going to have serious conversations about international law and sovereignty, we need to apply those principles consistently rather than selectively. The human cost of all this has been staggering, and it falls almost entirely on people who had no voice in the decisions that led to this catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers are dead or maimed. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes, with many unlikely to ever return. An entire generation of young men has been decimated. Infrastructure that took decades to build has been destroyed. Agricultural land has been contaminated with unexploded ordnance. And for what? What has all this sacrifice achieved? Ukraine has lost territory, lost population, lost its economic viability, and become entirely dependent on Western financial support that is already starting to wane as domestic political priorities shift in Washington and European capitals. Russia has been pushed closer to China, strengthening an axis that poses a far greater long-term challenge to Western interests than anything that existed before this conflict began. Europe has lost cheap energy, economic competitiveness, and strategic autonomy. The United States has expended enormous quantities of weapons and ammunition that will take years to replace, hollowing out stockpiles that might be needed for other contingencies. As we watch Ukrainian troops abandon their positions in Donetsk, we need to ask ourselves what comes next. The most likely scenario, barring some unforeseen development, is a negotiated settlement that recognizes Russian control over the territories they currently occupy, enshrines Ukrainian neutrality, and provides some fig leaf of face-saving language that allows all parties to claim they achieved their core objectives. This is essentially the deal that could have been reached in March 2022, before hundreds of thousands of people died, before tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure was destroyed, before the global economic disruption that has contributed to inflation and hardship worldwide. But because Western leaders convinced themselves that they could achieve a better outcome through force, because they believed their own propaganda about Russian weakness, because they prioritized geopolitical competition over human welfare, that opportunity was squandered. The final settlement, when it comes, will likely be less favorable to Ukraine than what could have been achieved through early diplomacy, a grim testament to the costs of hubris and miscalculation. The lessons from this conflict are profound and uncomfortable. We've learned that Western military superiority is not as absolute as we've been led to believe, that economic sanctions are a blunt instrument that can backfire spectacularly, that information dominance doesn't translate to battlefield success, and that the American-led unipolar moment is definitively over. We've learned that proxy wars, regardless of how they're justified, result in catastrophic human suffering that falls primarily on the populations being used as proxies. We've learned that the Western media political complex is capable of sustaining false narratives for extended periods, even when those narratives contradict observable reality. And we've learned that the moral certainty with which Western leaders approach international conflicts often masks a profound ignorance of history, culture, and the legitimate security concerns of other nations. None of this means that Russia's actions should be celebrated or that Putin's government represents some kind of virtuous alternative to Western power. But it does mean that we need a more honest, more nuanced understanding of how we got here and what it means for the future. The scenes we're witnessing in Donetsk of exhausted soldiers fleeing positions they can no longer hold are the final chapter of a tragedy that was avoidable. They represent the collapse not just of Ukrainian military positions, but of the entire strategic framework that Western policymakers constructed around this conflict. And as this chapter closes, we're left with the wreckage of a policy that sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives on the altar of geopolitical ambition, that destroyed any remaining credibility of Western moral leadership, and that accelerated the transition to a multipolar world order that will be far more chaotic and unpredictable than what came before. The question now is whether we can learn from this catastrophe or whether we're condemned to repeat similar mistakes in other theaters, because make no mistake, the same think tanks, the same media outlets, the same political leaders who pushed for this disastrous Ukraine policy are already setting their sights on other targets, already constructing narratives about other threats that require military solutions, already preparing the public for the next intervention. The only way to break this cycle is to demand accountability, to insist on honest reporting rather than propaganda, to question the assumption that American power can and should be projected everywhere regardless of the costs, and to remember that behind every geopolitical chess move are real human beings whose lives are destroyed when the game goes wrong. The troops running from the battlefield in Donetsk understand this reality viscerally. The rest of us need to understand it intellectually before we allow our leaders to drag us into the next unnecessary conflict.